Welcome to the Test Guild Automation Podcast, where we all get together to learn more about automation and software testing with your host, Joe Colantonio.
Hey, it's Joe, and welcome to another episode of the Test Guild Automation Podcast. All right, so here's the deal. I've been away. I took April off because of my 50th birthday. And so all the interviews I had, I released. And I planned on, after April, going back to work and interviewing a bunch of people and having new episodes. But unfortunately, I've been sick for the past 2 weeks, and I've been unable to interview anyone. So I have a bunch of new interviews coming away once I get my voice back, probably next week. But I've never gone in 7 years since this podcast started 3 weeks without releasing a new episode. So I'm going to share with you a episode I did on my security testing podcast. It was one of the highest listened to episodes there. If you don't know, I also have Test Guild, Secure Guild, security podcast. I have a Test Guild performance podcast. And this is going to be from an interview I did with Oliver, a VP and security expert at NeuraLegion, all about API testing and DevOps. And Ali really shares the importance of API security testing and what I think is really essential for anyone to know as a tester, regardless of if you're in security, performance, or functional automation. I think we all need to know more about security. It's going to be more and more important as the years go on. So listen up. Check it out. The Test Guild Automation Podcast is sponsored by the fantastic folks at Sauce Labs. Their cloud-based test platform helps ensure your favorite mobile apps and websites work flawlessly on every browser, operating system, and device. Get a free trial. Visit testguild.com/Sauce Labs and click on the exclusive sponsor section to try it for free for 14 days. Check it out. Hey, Ali, welcome to the Guild.
Thank you for having me, Joe. Good to be here.
Great. I guess before we get into the topic itself, could you just tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm VP Biz Dev and Strategic Alliances here at NeuraLegion. So assisting both our end clients and indeed our DevOps consulting partners on their journey at delivering AppSec testing automation across their pipelines. So I suppose a little bit about NeuraLegion itself. We're really a company that provides a developer-focused fuzzer and dast solution, enabling runtime AppSec compliance on every build. So I suppose similar to the way that Sneak may have revolutionized SCA, or perhaps SonarQube has transformed dast, we really try to simplify that process and making it work for developers, empowering them to and organizations to actually incorporate automated, accurate dast and fuzzing technology into every pull request so they can resolve security concerns as part of their development process.
Perfect. So Ali, my audience, I think, is mainly beginners. I could be wrong. So I just want to make sure everyone understands what some of this means. So can you just explain what is a dast and what is a fuzzer before we dive into that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So dast is dynamic application security testing. So it's almost like an automated black box test where you can run comprehensive security tests against your applications to look for security issues or security bugs so that obviously they're not being pushed out into production to ensure your cybersecurity posture. And obviously the earlier that you can do this in the process, the better. Ideally, organizations should really be striving to incorporate a dast solution into their development pipelines to be secure by design, and actually to be able to fix and remediate these issues as early as possible in order to be secure, as I mentioned.
Perfect. So, I know there's a push towards getting things shift left and more developers getting involved in testing their software, but it seems to be mostly done on like the web front end type of activities. And, APIs have been around for a long time now. And for some reason, I still see that a lot of, maybe I'm wrong, a lot of companies, a lot of developers still aren't really focusing in on API or API testing. Do you know why that might be?
Well, I think that when you look at the dast market, and, it's a very well-established technology, but APIs are, relatively new in comparison to web apps. And the way that these applications are being now architected, is shifting. And there's a very, very heavy reliance on APIs. And I think that where there is a massive gap is that typically these automated tools just didn't really have the ability to test APIs, or perhaps looking at single page applications that rely obviously very heavily on API calls. And it's that sort of left the market with a heavy reliance on manual testing. And, I think that perhaps is the main issue, and one that really, really needs to be addressed, particularly when you're looking at DevOps and when you're looking at DevSecOps, where you need that automation and you need to remove the manual human bottlenecks that are so synonymous with not only application security testing, but specifically in relation to API security testing too.
Absolutely. And I guess you mentioned two reasons why it seems to be more prevalent now than before with APIs, microservices and single page applications. Is that what you see also as a vendor? I love talking to vendors because you speak to a bunch of different clients and customers. Are more and more companies building applications that really have a foundation of microservices or single page applications? And maybe that's why we're seeing more and more interest, I guess, in API testing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're seeing there has been a massive shift, but now we're really seeing digital transformation, business transformation, really, really leading the way. I mean, when you look at, financial services, banking, with all the sort of the startups that are being over the top banking, when you look at the open banking directive, for example, there's a lot, there are many ways that organizations can now interact with each other. And APIs is obviously driving that as well. Microservices, absolutely, with organizations re-architecting their legacy applications, migrating them into the cloud as part of that digital transformation projects, you're seeing more and more a heavy reliance on APIs. It's a much more effective way of being able to support that agile development when you have multiple different microservices that you can work on individually and scale your development processes with that methodology.
Perfect. I think this maybe it's just what I see is I think there's a misperception almost about API security in that when you see a web app, you can see it and there's a user interface and a hacker probably can attack it this way. But for some reason, I think maybe we get a false sense of security when we create headless type technology because we think, no one's going to be able to see this API or know how to interact. Is that a common misconception? How common is API security breaches?
Well, API security breaches are common, and we've seen some very, very well-established, renowned organizations have what have been some pretty severe breaches, or where they've been lucky, some API breaches that perhaps have been detected with bug bounties, etc. The rise of the API really has been the writing's been on the wall for a very, very long time. Gartner, very, very recently they've done multiple surveys, but they say that actually it's 90% of web-enabled applications will have more of an attack surface area in the form of exposed APIs rather than user interfaces. And that's only going to grow exponentially as more and more organizations are pushing forward with their digital transformation and will rely very, very heavily on microservices-based architectures and subsequently, obviously, their heavy reliance on APIs. Whether that's still using the old SOAP API, of course, the vast majority of organizations will be pushing towards REST APIs. But we're also seeing a very marked increase in the number of organizations that are going to be relying on GraphQL. And I think that's a very, very interesting API methodology that I think we'll see grow exponentially over the next few years. And we've certainly seen an increase in demand for GraphQL testing over recent months.
So this might be a dumb question. Is there one method that's less secure than others, like say SOAP or REST or GraphQL? Are they equally can be attacked, or is one more prone to attacks or security hacks?
Well, I think looking at security in that way is actually the wrong way of looking at it. Everything has the ability to be hacked unless you're putting the right efforts in the right places. Ultimately, every organization needs to take security testing very, very seriously. And in order to do that, in order to keep up with the agile development methods with DevOps, it's all really about automation. And we're seeing so So many times when I'm speaking to clients, whether that's younger startups or indeed enterprise organizations with hundreds, if not thousands of developers, there's a heavy reliance on manual testing. And when you look at the number of iterations that organizations, the number of concurrent builds that organizations have, it's very, very hard to maintain a good security posture, regardless if one is going to be more secure than the other. Because the technical debt that accumulates without the ability to automate that process is unsurmountable. And that's where you have your issues. Everyone talks about, whether it's right or wrong, the gulf in terms of the job space in the cybersecurity industry. There are 1 million cybersecurity jobs. I think the last count that I checked in the US alone, I believe, in order to keep up. Automation really, really is key in order to achieve that. And, I think it's not which one is perhaps more secure. I'm not sure there's going to be much in it. I think the focus really is, how can we ensure that whether we're still relying on SOAP, where lots of organizations don't or are very much moving away from that, REST or indeed GraphQL, how can we ensure that regardless of which ones of those we're using, we can be secure by design? We can detect these security vulnerabilities as early as possible as part of our DevOps methodology to shift that security left. And some organizations, it really depends on their maturity level. Whether they're immature, organizations talk about, okay, let's start right in order to shift left. I think organizations have an issue where perhaps they're striving for perfection at the cost of actually making any progress. And I think that's where organizations need to say, okay, how can we start? Culture, the people and the processes are very, very important. But then comes, okay, what tooling can assist us to drive that forward? Or what tooling can enable us to achieve some form of progress whilst we then mature, then gives us the ability to scale as we mature those processes as well.
Absolutely. And I know, once again, with web development, there's a high reliance now on open source components that basically developers are just taking all these open source components, stringing them together and coming out with a solution. I don't know if that's the same with API. And if so, I know there's a rise with security breaches with open source packages, but are there any known API type libraries that people may be using that could have exploits in them? So they may be focusing on their own code as being secure, but now looking at third-party components they may be using that actually are causing security issues?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that will always be the case, whether it's APIs or indeed web apps. Speaking with organizations, absolutely a good, SCA is going to be very important, particularly as you mentioned that it's very easy to bundle up a few of those and get a functioning application. And you need to ensure that those vulnerabilities are patched, as it were. But you will always need a full pen test, let's say. I think anyone that says you're going to fully automate that process is going to be wrong. You always need to do a sort of final check. And, we have many clients that will say, we've implemented, a sneak, for example, and actually now we want to then, over the top of that, add a very, very comprehensive dast. And, where is it in the process that you're going to be doing that? So whether I'm talking to the security architect that wants to deliver automation so that they're not relying on either in-house VA or very expensive outsourced third-party VA that's going to be done periodically, they want to be able to automate that process, either for their own teams, either putting a tool in the hands of their QA to deliver security assurance when they're delivering their QA or the functional testing, ultimately with a view to being able to put a security tool into the hands of those that are not security experts, such as your developers. To, as I mentioned previously in the opening paragraph, to be able to run a security test on every build, every commit, or every pull request that they're making.
Great. And, you mentioned before that there still seems to be a high reliance on manual testing. And I'm not sure why that would be with API testing, since it seems they'd be a lot more automatable because you're not dealing with the UI front end. But a lot of pushback I get with folks is, well, our customers are using our UI, so if we test through the UI, then we have all the APIs covered because the APIs are being called from the front end. So there's extra overhead. So are there any pushback to testing APIs? Is it an education issue? Or why do you think people are still relying on manual testing for these type of testing activities?
Well, I think the main problem that organizations face is actually with the inability of their automated tools at truly being able to capture or detect the attack surface. So it's really a coverage issue. Typically relying on crawling, it's just not going to cut it, I'm afraid, to put it quite bluntly. APIs are, a different beast to just having, a web application. And I think that's where the sort of focus, I suppose, would need to be. The majority of processing and perhaps the logic is at the client, sending the API requests, getting raw data back, and then the processing is carried out on the client side. And it's this that's led to sort of fundamental changes to the security threat model. It's now the client that has a lot of the access to the data, the raw data, and the back end is relying on the client side. And if the hackers can then, if they're able to intercept that data and to exploit and use the API directly, that's where they can really change a lot of that data. And that's obviously been made worse by the decomposition of applications into microservices. And that's what's led in this attack surface growing exponentially. So, when testing an API, for example, the crawl is not going to work. Actually, you need different discovery methods. So whether that's utilizing or leveraging a half file, a recorded interaction with the target application. If you wanted to integrate it into your development pipelines, does your tooling enable you to upload a Swagger or an Open API specification? Organizations use Postman, for example. Can the tooling leverage and consume your Postman collections? And typically what you find is the answer to that is no. So you have to have that reliance on manual testing. And, I like to differentiate manual testing and the testing carried out by your developers as part of their pipeline. Because the security personnel can also perhaps, either with some tooling, with different proxies, test an API in a semi-automated way. But the notion of DevOps is really trying to shift that security testing left to put these capabilities into the hands of your developers, your engineering team, or your QA if you're not at that stage, to be able to run a comprehensive security test on each of those build on a specific entry point with a set range of parameters to test for security vulnerabilities. And I think that needs to be the focus for organizations, as opposed to constantly shifting it right and saying it's not our responsibility. And, my mother always said, a carpenter never blames his tools. But I think, in the DevOps world, once you've got the culture and once you've got the processes in place, the tooling does play a fundamental role. And ultimately, a lot of blame, in inverted commas, if I can say that, can be placed on the tooling. They're slow, they're perhaps complicated to use. One major issue with, perhaps not so much with API testing, but certainly with web application security testing, is the inaccuracy of the results you get, the false positives, that actually leads to even more bottlenecks downstream. How can you effectively deal with this? And you need a dast tool that perhaps gives you that single pane of glass where you can test your web applications, your single page applications, your APIs, with one specific tool that's going to give you the detection and, more importantly, the coverage that you need.
Absolutely. And I think you have a webinar on this, and you had like 4 main areas I think a tool should help you with. And one of them was the single pane of glass type of activity. But you also had 3 other ones, like coverage analysis, payload and detection, and speed. Now, it sounds like almost a lot of these dast tools probably have been in the market for a long time. So what you're saying is APIs are kind of newer. And even if you look at OWASP, I think there's a different OWASP top 10 for APIs compared to web. So maybe they don't have some of these newer areas to be focusing on. So for a newer tool, like what makes your tool different in these areas compared to maybe another solution that someone may be using? And is your solution complementary to what they already have invested in?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yes, OWASP have the OWASP top 10 for APIs. And a lot of the list is very similar to your standard OWASP top 10, perhaps in a different order. But I think that, what you need to ensure, DevOps, I mentioned before that you need the culture and the processes. It's about collaboration between security teams, breaking down those silos, creating champions in each of them, to spearhead that change, to sell, but also manage security testing automation, with your developers, to be a sort of go-between that speaks the different languages across the pipeline. But then I think it's being able to empower these different teams in order so that you can actually scale your testing, but also to ensure that you're doing it at speed. DevOps is all about automation and speed. And the last thing you want to do is add, delays into that processes. So with shifting left, it means ultimately that putting security testing into the hands of your developers. They need to be your first line of defense, as it were. So to enable them to detect, to prioritize, and treat the security defects like they do with their functional defects, to fix them early. That's going to be the cheapest time possible. It's going to mean that you're not then going to be accumulating that technical debt that I mentioned already. But in order to do that, you need a tool that a developer can actually use, not a tool that's built for security professionals that is going to be probably disabled by the developers and join shelfware. The amount of times I speak to clients where they have licenses with other tech that's just not being utilized. They're complicated to use and they're complicated to configure. So a tool that can test both web apps and APIs, that single pane of glass that you mentioned, of course, is going to get additional buy-in from the teams. But I think that you hit the nail on the head in terms of attacks and payloads. So developers aren't expected to understand, okay, well, I'm testing my web app now, and then I'm going to be testing my API by leveraging my schema. Which tests should I be utilizing here? And that's where our technology really differentiates itself. So we have very, very smart engine. We have reinforcement learning, machine learning. Some organizations and people love to hear that, others don't. But actually what it enables us to do is to automate the process of maximizing or optimizing scan speeds to complement DevOps as much as you can. So our technology has the ability of a smart scanning functionality where we can look at the target and understand which attacks and which payloads are going to be more relevant, which parameters are going to be static parameters that perhaps if we didn't understand what they were, we would then carry out these tests against parameters that perhaps wouldn't have an effect on the target application. So we have the ability of removing the noise, as it were, and carrying out very specific targeted tests against parts of the target that are going to be relevant. And all that's really about maximizing or optimizing the scan speed without relying on the developers to know what they're doing. So it's really trying to simplify AppSec testing so that you can put the trust into the developers, integrated across their pipeline, so they have that security feedback loop, to raise a ticket in GitHub or Jira, but also ensuring that the CISO or the security team have full visibility of where are the vulnerabilities being made, with which team, on which project, then can actually aid in understanding where do we need to apply some security awareness training, which teams are making which common mistake. And actually, it's nipping it in the bud. It's enabling your developers to realize, okay, I've made a mistake. I'm being caught up on it or brought up on it now as I'm doing it, not 3 months down the line, particularly when it comes down to API testing, which is very much periodic, quarterly, biannually, or indeed annually. And it's the accuracy of the tools that I think plays a very, very big part in that. So if we're looking at DevOps or we're looking at CI/CD, that's completely counterintuitive, or it's the antithesis of being able to achieve that methodology when you're getting inaccurate results that need a manual validation of the vulnerabilities. So one key fundamental differentiator of NeuraLegion's technology is the ability to, in a fully automated way, validate every vulnerability that we're able to exploit, which means that there's no need for the triaging of false positives. There's not a heavy drain on the security team to manually validate those. So every vulnerability that's detected, developers can, knowing full well that it's been exploited with a proof of concept, that it's a true positive, to fix it immediately. And I think those 3 or 4 key features are what organizations need to put together a robust security program, but one that's actually going to keep up with or maintain the speed of DevOps and not cause that drag.
I 100% agree. I come from a functional testing background, so the same issues you're talking about here are the same issues with functional testing or when people check in code, developers check in code, they have unit tests, a lot of false positives. They start turning flags off so that it doesn't run, or if it doesn't meet a certain threshold, it gets kicked back. So they start doing weird things to work around that. And also it takes up a lot of time. And so they get mad when you add more and more of these scanners. So I guess the biggest thing I want to dive into here is the machine learning AI piece that seems to be a buzzword in functional testing. So can you just explain a little bit more? Like it finds a defect, a developer checks in code, it finds an exploit in one of their APIs, and you're saying it's a true issue because you have some technology that's able to determine it's a real issue, not a false positive. Then what happens? Does the developer have enough information to know from the tool that, okay, not only do I know it's a real issue, but now I know how to fix it? Or do they still need to work with the security team to say, hey, what do I do here? I have no idea what this is doing here, what this means.
Yeah, and you raise a very, very good point there. So, everyone talks about web app scanners. And I think that really gives you the best understanding of the difference between other dast tools and our dast. We don't scan. We communicate with, we interact with the target application. So we go through a process of browser automation. So we are communicating with the target application as if a human would. And that enables us to go through an automatic validation process. And a nice example of that would be with a reflective XSS, for example, where we will almost render the page and look for that reflection, showcase with an automated screenshot the reflection as a proof of concept. And of course, every vulnerability that's detected is provided with all the response, the request, with a diff-like view so developers can really understand where the issue is. All the response and the body is all provided. We can give you details of remediation advice, links to additional resources, whether that's with our own knowledge base on how to remediate so that developers can understand where you've gone wrong so that they can read up about it. They can then go away and try and remediate and fix. And then the technology also provides the developer with the ability to execute that same attack, execute that same payload, post-remediation to see if it's been remediated successfully without the need to then suddenly go and recall a new scan. So absolutely, the key focus really is enabling developers to be able to, mark their own homework, but also when they get back a vulnerability, that it's been verified and it's been validated as a true positive. Here's the proof of concept, and this is what you need to do to remediate. And by the way, probably if you're doing it now, not 3 months later, when perhaps that developer's moved on to a new project, working on a different microservices or working at a different company, they're learning on the go. And, I think that's where organizations need to go. It's really about ensuring that your developers are not going to be routinely making the same mistakes again and again and again. And the best way of educating them is by pulling them up on their mistakes as early as possible. But from a business perspective, I think I always mention, for the number crunchers out there, it's going to be the cheapest, most efficient time for you to remediate those fixes, whilst from a security perspective, it's going to ensure that you are intrinsically secure by design so that less is being pushed out into production that's going to be vulnerable. And you're going to have some automation or orchestration for your CI/CD pipelines. One thing you can't categorically have is builds failing for no reason, because that's when you suddenly need to start, monetizing your risk. Okay, well, we've done a test. We know where our problems are. We've got 250 vulnerabilities here. We know that probably 80% of them are going to be false positives. What do we do? The needs of the business say that we need to release. The security guys are saying, come on, don't do that. You've got an agile entrepreneurial engineering team that's probably headed up by a CEO, for a new tech startup that says, come on, guys, we need to deliver these new features to our clients. But then security is always going to be that friction in between. So we've removed the false positives. We've made it very, very easy for developers to use. We've removed the complicated configuration of not only the scans, but also configuring the scans so that the results are going to be relevant to minimize. Most tools talk about minimizing false positives. We remove them, remove the noise, remove the alert fatigue or exhaustion so that, you can put security testing into the hands of your engineering team.
Great. And, I don't know if this is a cultural thing or if you see this as well. With functional testing, a lot of times developers are like, we have a suite of automation tests we run, so I don't really need to test my code. So if you have a solution like you're explaining here, how much testing does a developer still need to do? Or can someone have overconfidence in the tooling to think, oh, we're covered, we have a scanner, uses AI machine learning, so we're good to go. Don't really need to focus in on security as much because it'll be caught by the tooling.
Well, no, I think, look, no developer wants to put security bugs or even functional bugs, into their products. And, ultimately, they're still going to be picked up on it, whether it's now or whether it's later. Speaking with teams, speaking with our clients, you want it done as soon as possible. You want to be brought up on these issues as early as possible. And ultimately, you don't want to then make that same mistake again. No one wants to go back and redo work they've already done. So I think it depends on the team. There's always going to be, perhaps some people, a cultural thing, like you say, but I think in one office, you might have many different cultures where there may be a heavy reliance on saying, well, I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to, I'll just let the scanner pick it up and then I'll fix it. But, ultimately, if you're the one that's going to be coming back at the end of the day or at the end of the month or the week with multiple different fixes, then it's not going to look good on you. And you're the one that's going to be the bottleneck. So, I don't think that's really an issue. I think people want to ensure that they're doing the right thing. And in an ideal situation, organizations, regardless whether that's the development, the engineering team, right up through to the CISO, to the CEO, just want to ensure that they're being as efficient as possible, as dynamic and agile as they possibly can, without adding more work. So no, I think most organizations and most teams, in my experience anyway, don't mind the notion of being pulled up on issues or fixes. But by the same token, there are, subject to the size of teams, yes, I won't be naming any names, but there are organizations that say, sometimes what you don't know, and suddenly and what are you going to do about it is perhaps what you're alluding to, Joe. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I think now organizations are realizing that I don't really think you can take that stance anymore. There's so much at stake. Recently, I think it was a psychology department in Finland that got breached, and there's a hacker, exploiting people that had psychological assessments, from their early teens right up through to adulthood that are now being exploited for money. Otherwise, they'll release their records. That's just one recent example of the last few days. So security is really, really so important. There's so much data now that attackers can exploit and leverage that people are waking up and taking security testing seriously. And they're realizing that APIs now really is the key to that data. And you need to make sure that they are intrinsically secure, not relying on manual testing that's going to be periodic, unless you've got very, very deep pockets that you're able to run those manual tests on a daily basis. But with, organizations have 50, 100, 1,000 different APIs, it's really a scalability issue.
So you mentioned about communication a lot, culture. You are using AI machine learning. What other insights can be bubbled up? I mean, over time, is it smart enough to say, our team B that checks and code always has SQL injection issues. So maybe we need to invest in some more education here. I guess what other insights are being bubbled up to the teams security-wise with your tool over time?
Yeah, well, I think that's going to be the main one. There's a very big focus now on coding education, security awareness. And I think trying to understand not only your internal teams, but a lot of organizations also outsource development to third parties. And I think you also need to be in a position to be able to validate what they're doing, assigning them as a specific project or a group like you can with our technology to say, okay, well, are you delivering us secure software? Are you delivering us secure APIs? And if you're not, you go back and make the fix and do it now before you deliver it to us. That's for external players. But of course, regardless of, whether you're a technology company or whether you're a supermarket or Walmart, you want to ensure that anything that you're doing is going to be efficient and that your team have the requisite training to ensure that they're delivering a maximum effect. So the CISO dashboard that we call it on our technology enables you to have that full visibility. So not only is it, okay, where's our risk immediately? I want a snapshot now of our top 20 assets. I want to be able to run a dast tool now. Let's come back to the results. I want to know where I am now. So we've removed the false positive, which means that actually you know where your risks are, because we don't need to wait 7 or 10 days for the reports to be manually filtered or triaged. And that way you can then understand where your risk is. And then if you can then go a little bit granular, you can say, okay, well, we've got this risk here. And actually we've noticed that, yeah, the SQL injection issues seem to be quite prominent in Team E. And Team E are working on this asset. This is our holy grail. This is the one that, as a trading platform, this is the one where all of our clients are transacting. Let's give them specific training, specifically in dealing with SQL injection. What are they doing wrong? Let's try and nip it in the bud. And we're seeing a lot of that. And that really is a main focus for organizations. They want to ensure that their teams are working not only effectively maintaining that agile DevOps methodology and the speed that comes with it, but also to ensure that they can always improve. And I think us, NeuraLegion as an organization, we're very, very, everything we do, we look back and we learn from it. From positives, how can we be even better? But also we'll always take any negatives so that we can improve to ensure that we're delivering better technology and a better service to our clients. And I think any serious business would want to do the same.
Oh yeah, I mean, what I really love about that also is you could test everything and everything all the time, but it almost sounds like this helps you focus not on everything, but mostly on risk. And so people, in my experience, have really bad at risk assessment. So it almost sounds like not only are you testing more, but you also can focus in on the areas of risk within your business. Like this module is critical to all our customers. So here's the risks that have been bubbled up to us as an issue. So this is where we want to focus a lot of our testing efforts going forward, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I can give, sort of 2 examples. So if you're looking at a younger, let's just say a startup, and, they want to integrate security testing as part of their pipeline, great. Start now, try and shift security testing left. And actually what you find is that, you haven't got that accumulating debt of remediating fixes. And you can be, sort of generate that more secure by design approach. When you're looking at a large enterprise client, so let's say one of the big multinational banks, where the amount of technical debt that they have has been accumulating perhaps for years. And they know where their risk is, but they just haven't got the resource to be able to remediate it. Their development and engineering teams are going like the clappers, and it's spiraling out of control. So you need to be able to take a snapshot of, okay, where are we now? And it's the issue of, one, the detection of the coverage. If you're going to have coverage issues, you need to then always go back and rely on the manual testing. So, APIs is always going to have that issue because you don't have the automated tools that are going to provide you with the automation to test and the coverage. But you also then have the issue of, okay, well, great, we've done all these tests, but we've got a massive pile of vulnerabilities here that we need to fix. So, okay, now let's start segmenting them. Let's look at either a CVSS scoring, or let's look at the issue type or the severity. And let's now go and fragment that into, let's take our 1,000 assets, and now let's look at our top 50 for the moment. And suddenly you find yourself having to forget about a vast majority of your assets to focus on the ones that are most paramount to your organization. So where enterprise organizations are trying to go and trying to move to is with automation, and ultimately, try and remove the backlog that they have. But from a CISO's perspective, to be able to take a snapshot in time to say, where are we at? Where's my risk? I need to feed back to the board to say, these are the issues. These are the resources that I need. We've now don't need to rely heavily on our security team. And I don't know if, there's a really interesting statistic. The number of developers to security, the ratio is 50-1 respectively. So, it's always going to be an uphill struggle when you've got that ratio. If you imagine the number of iterations, the number of builds, they're really, really working towards business transformation and generating new products and new features. Security just can't keep up. And that's why automation is really, really so important. And you have to have that automation in order to understand where your risk is. GRC is so important to organizations, but it's very, very difficult to understand where you are unless you've got that accuracy and, the scalability to be able to test ideally as early as possible. And when our co-founders started with NeuraLegion, that was really one of the main focus. Coming from a CTO and a CISO perspective, they understand the needs of, one, ensuring that AppSec can keep up with the pace of development, but then from a CISO's perspective with his other hat, understanding that I need to know where I'm at. I need to know where my risks are. And at the moment, I'm just looking at so much noise, and it's very, very difficult for me to prioritize the remediation, to try and prioritize the risks that I want to try and remediate now, and then start clearing up the backlog.
So, Oliver, I know I mentioned earlier that you did actually have a really great webinar. I'll have it in the show notes, kind of around this topic as well. And I think you did a few polls around, people's maturity around API testing. Just curious to know if you could share some of those results with us.
Yeah, sure. So, in the webinar, Rest Assured DevSecOps for APIs, I ran a poll that asked the attendees how they would describe their API security testing processes. And I actually also put that on LinkedIn, put that on Twitter as well. And the results were surprising on the one hand, but really, really not surprising on the other. So an overwhelming 80% or thereabouts, I think it was 79% of respondents carried out their API security testing manually. 50% of which I think was internal, and the other was done by a third party. It's not surprising given that historically the available tooling is very ineffective at best at automating the process, purely from a detection, a coverage perspective, for example. But, with almost 50% outsourcing their manual testing to a third party, that's a very expensive problem that compounds these issues, I think even further. Speaking with one client recently, one of their main problems was actually how long it took to simply book the testing in with their supplier, let alone having to wait for the test and the reports, of their annual scan. So, not only is it manual, but it's so periodic. And how many iterations were there, prior to that? Some organizations are lucky to have internal testing teams, but as I've alluded to before, with the ratio of security to developers, 50-1, it's just not scalable, especially with the sheer number of iterations that we've mentioned that compounds the issues. And, very few companies, I think, have the requisite maturity or indeed the experience in their security teams to develop their own, convoluted automation with custom scripts, for example. And that's going completely against the notion of DevOps. So I think there were some in the region of 9% of those that, I'm being probably quite cynical about this, but those that claim to have it fully automated. But I think in my experience, those conversations I've had where they said, yes, you've got our API security testing automated, it's very much later in the process. And, you don't get that immediate feedback loop to developers that you really, really need to achieve that shift left methodology that comes hand in hand with DevOps.
Wow. Awesome results. Okay, Ali, before we go, is there one piece of actionable advice you can give to someone to help them with their API DevOps security testing efforts? And what's the best way to find or contact you or learn more about your solution?
I think, look, first and foremost, I think you need to have buy-in. You need to have that culture. You need to have, someone from, security sat with your developers or someone from your development team that is going to be pro-security. And then I think, once you have that, then the rest should really follow. But, I mentioned before that in order to really achieve that, in order to maintain that agile entrepreneurial spirit that a lot of organizations and engineering teams have, you need to have automation of your security testing. And keeping this relevant to APIs, you need a tool that has the ability to test whether, multiple different API methodologies or architectures, So if you're using REST or SOAP or maybe more, or if you want to perhaps shift to using GraphQL in the future, make sure that your tooling has the ability to do that. You need to find a tool that provides you with multiple different discovery methods of the attack surface. So whether that's generating HAR files in an automated way, right from the developer's dashboard, with a CLI tool that consume or leverage, whether it's API, open API, so Swagger files, for example. Are you using your Postman collections? Are you using other QA automation tools like Selenium or Cypress.io? Why carry out more work? Why don't you leverage the work that you're doing already and make your security testing tool work with you to get your compliance test with the OWASP API top 10, for example? If your appetite's more If you're more hungry for more sophisticated testing, fuzz testing your APIs is something that organizations are really, really looking at the moment. And we've seen a big increase in that. But really importantly, it's about seamlessly integrating it across your pipelines via either a REST API. I mentioned with the CLI tool, how can it integrate into other common CI/CD tools, whether it's Circle CI or Jenkins, Jira for your ticketing, to ensure that you get that automation enabling you to bake it across your security pipelines. And this is really what NeuraLegion's technology has been built from the ground up to try and achieve. We're a security testing tool that has been built with a dev-first approach. We enable organizations to put security testing into the hands of the developers, into the hands of your QA, governed by and managed by your security team and your CISO to get full visibility of where your vulnerabilities are, to deliver accurate, actionable results to developers, to remediate as early as possible, to be secure by design. And for any additional information, please feel free to reach out to me. Joe, I'm sure you'll put my contact details at the bottom. We have a very, very extensive blog and resource page. Please read up about us. And obviously, if you have any questions, we're here to help.
Thanks again for your automation awesomeness. For links to everything in Value we covered in this episode, head on over to testguild.com/A348. And while you're there, make sure to click on the Try for Free Today link under the exclusive sponsor section to learn all about Sauce Labs' awesome products and services. And if the show has helped you in any way, why not rate it and review it in iTunes? Reviews really help in the rankings of the show, and I read each and every one of them. So that's it for this episode of the Test Guild Automation Podcast. I'm Joe, and my mission is to help you succeed with creating end-to-end, full-stack automation awesomeness. As always, test everything and keep the good. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Test Guild Automation Podcast. Head on over to testguild.com for full show notes, amazing blog articles, and online testing conferences. Don't forget to subscribe to the Guild to continue your testing journey.